explain, some of you joined later. Although I am sitting in the Institute of Diplomatico, that's simply a coincidence. I happen to be in Rome working for the United Nations FAO, doing a training course in social media. So I took the opportunity to use the very good bandwidth that the Institute has installed recently to give it access to the internet. I work as an advisor, a communication advisor for the DiploFoundation, and in that context I've been doing e-diplomacy research and training for the last 3 or 4 years. Diplo, as I'm sure you know, has been involved in what we now call e-diplomacy since before it was called e-diplomacy, since before when we talked about it as the use of technology, using the internet to support diplomatic functions. And so it's very interesting to review what's been happening in the last few years from that perspective. We're talking about something which is probably as old as the internet, but then the internet's not very old, and the web is actually hardly old at all. We're talking under 10 years, and there's been a phenomenal pace of change. I hope you can all see the presentation. If you can't see the presentation, please let us know. You should see slide 1, where it says social media for diplomats, context, competence, and capability. Some of you, if anyone's seen any of the, thank you, Ginger, if anyone's seen any of the presentations that we've been doing in the e-diplomacy days that Diplo has been organizing, then we've talked quite a lot about essential e-competencies. So part of the presentation, the sort of central part, if you like, is around that. But I also want to try and move on, if we have time, to talk about organizational capability, which actually picks up Victoria's question about what might hinder the optimal usage, because I think that the experience I've gained so far from working in different ministries is that there are often keen users of web tools, social media tools, but they are hindered by the structures within the ministries, which are in many cases lagging behind, not in all cases at all. So I want to talk a little bit about capability, and I think that's going to be one of the themes for our work this year. So I'll move on. Like everybody else, I go to Wikipedia first for any kind of definitions. And Wikipedia is absolutely classic social media. It is constructed from a crowd of people. It's crowdsourced information. And it has the strengths and weaknesses of crowdsourced information in that its strength is that if enough people contribute, we will get series of facts and series of answers that actually meet the needs of all the people that come to the site. The disadvantage of a very open, socially managed site like Wikipedia is that sometimes you'll find very curious things in the middle of the site. So social media, essentially, it's about, the word that's missing there is online. It's interactions among people, and it's about creating, sharing, exchanging information, and critically, in virtual communities and networks. All of you who are diplomats who are watching this webinar, you all belong to the community of diplomats. You belong to various networks. And what social media gives us is a way to extend those natural human ties, those social ties, into online spaces, the virtual world. What I want to look at is 3 elements. The context, I think, and it's important to keep track of the context, how it changes, move then into essential e-competencies, and then, if we have time, I'll leave some time for questions between 2 and 3, then move into change and institutional capability. A lot of the material that I'm using comes out of information provided and the presentations from practicing diplomats, people who work in and around the Diplo community. This is one of the many slides that comes out of a very good piece of research from the University of Sussex, the Institute of Development Studies, and the link is not actually available on these notes, but when we put the presentation up on SlideShare, we'll make sure that the link is there. The key point about this is that for a long time we've sort of known that what used to be called the digital divide is no longer actually a digital divide in any clear and obvious sense. This is a piece of research in 6 countries, well, 5 countries there. There's 2 sets of research information not complete yet, looking at what they called policy actors. And by policy actors, we mean the kind of people that diplomats want to influence. So people in government, people in leading NGOs, people in civil society, people in ministries, who are involved in policy processes, and they did a piece of detailed research around the online information seeking habits and the use of online tools, and not just online, mobile tools, the use of mobile telephony, the use of iPads and other forms of tablet. And I don't want to spend a long time on this. If I did a survey, this survey, with everybody who's present here, we would find probably about the same pattern. The most striking thing about this survey is that amongst the policy actors, effectively the elite within all of those countries, people operate in much the same way that I operate when I'm at my home base in Oxford in the UK. So I use the internet all the time for communication and emails. I use a lot of Skype. If you move on down, if I'm seeking health-related information, I get quite a lot online, but I tend to go to individuals. So what this really demonstrates is we no longer have two worlds, a connected and unconnected. We do indeed have other worlds. We have age barriers, we have capacity barriers, we have cost barriers. But in terms of people who have access through their offices, through their lives, to the internet, they operate in much the same way throughout the world using these tools. And that's very different to even 5 years ago. And clearly, what has made a difference is mobile phones. Because in many parts of the world, including many parts of Africa, the majority of access is done through the internet, is done through mobile phones. This is the kind of obvious stuff. We all know that the big social media sites are just expanding, exploding exponentially. This is information that came out of Huffington Post in January. Just some random statistics, but it is going to reinforce this to us, the sheer scale of what we're talking about. Facebook is close to 1 billion users. Just pause and think about that. 1 billion people are using the same site. And I'm just going to check the chat. Yep. We're not the only elite. It makes the divide greater. No, we're not the only elite. By we, do you mean the diplomats, Deirdre, or do you mean we as in the connected? I was particularly focused on policy actors. Sorry. Back to my slides. It's worth having a look at these. A note, if you look over there, 25% of users don't bother with privacy settings. If there's one thing you take away from this webinar, if you haven't spent 2 hours on Facebook crawling through all the privacy and confidential settings, please do. Facebook, like all social networks, makes their money in various ways. They want all of the information about us to be as open as possible so that advertisers can gain access to our habits and send us targeted advertisements. That also means anything to do with your personal life, with your work life, is all entirely open on the web. So be one of the 75%, not one of the 25%. So remarkable, huge quantities of information is now passed through the internet. I was very surprised at this next one. I don't know how many people are on Twitter in this webinar, increasing numbers I'm guessing. I was very surprised to learn that Google+, which is Google's social network, is actually the second largest social network. And that is surprising, because most people that I know belong to Google+, but don't use it very actively. So one of the things that we're going to be exploring in Diplo is precisely what is the bonus of Google+. But all of this suggests that throughout the globe, people are continually experimenting, exploring the different tools. And we've lost a slide. Apologies. There is another slide which, in my busyness, I seem to have missed before I talk about Anne-Marie Slaughter. There are as many active social media users in China as there are in the rest of the world combined. There are 4 leading Chinese social media networks, and many of them have several 100,000 users. So whatever figures you see standardly in the headlines in publications like the Huffington Post, multiply it. So there are huge audiences that don't actually connect into the mainstream media that we normally connect with. Deirdre has posted another question, policy actors separated from citizens. I'll come back to that, if I may, when we get into organizational capability. But yes, clearly there are divides within all countries. The biggest divide in the UK is actually age. If you want to identify who is online and who is active, if you take 3 standard indicators of education level, of income, and of age, you'll find the majority of people who are not engaged in the internet tend to be older, tend to be poorer educated, and tend to be poorer, which is precisely the kind of people who often need the support of the state. But that's another story. So the other thing I want to say about context, if none of you have come across this article by Anne-Marie Slaughter, and Anne-Marie, she's an academic now, works at Cranston. She wrote a book, she wrote an article, The Big Picture Beyond Hotspots and Crises in Our Interconnected World, and there is a link for that in the notes, and it will be on the SlideShare presentation. But she was also the US State Department Director of Policy and Planning, so she kind of worked between the both worlds. And she wrote a piece distinguishing between what she calls a billiard ball world and a Lego world. And in her terms, the billiard ball world is something which was very traditionally the domain of diplomats. Relations were fundamentally between ministries of foreign affairs. There were unipolar relationships between the states, and there remain many situations where that's the current case. So to use the example of the US and Iran, there is very little communication between different institutions in the US and Iran. It tends to be at a state level. And in that billiard ball world, there were closed boxes. And what she describes as the Lego world is a shift in power from governments to social actors. They both coexist, but they need different kinds of leadership and diplomacy. It's very important in the context of social media. Slaughter says that states come apart in a Lego world, and essentially it's echoing what many people have said over the last, 10 years about the network world. She gives the example of 4 US departments who in previous years may actually have channeled all their communications through ministries of foreign affairs, through the US State Department. But actually these days, those agencies, the EPA, Justice, Treasury, interact directly with their counterparts in other countries. They also interact directly with social actors outside of government. So the Lego world, governments get taken apart and coalitions come together between different actors in what used to, I'm pausing because what used to be called the nation state. So boundaries are getting more porous because the coalitions between church groups, between academic groups, between social actors across what are still national boundaries are very different in the Lego world. And one of the key things for diplomats and for the context of social media is power and leadership. So in the billiard ball world, it's traditional hierarchical power from the top, controlling agendas, structuring options and preferences. The UK Foreign Minister William Hague talks a lot about the network world. It's a horizontal world, it's a web. Power is exercised from the center, not the top. You can't command, so you mobilize. And the most connected person is the person at the center, the one who can mobilize everybody else. And it follows a connect and orchestrate model. Absolutely quintessentially, the use of social media in the rebellions in Tunisia and in Egypt and indeed other parts of the Arab-speaking world were very much in this context of a Lego world. It was connected people who could mobilize other people who were absolutely key in those processes. They didn't replace the bravery on the streets, but they were very much part of that process. So that's what I mean by the new context. The web is everywhere, social media is everywhere, the way the world is working is different. And there's a symbiosis between the breaking apart of the state, if you like, the Lego world and social media, because actually social media impacts and influences the way that the Lego world works and in turn is influenced by that. So I want to move on to the essential e-competencies. I mean, people have been writing for some years about competencies for the information age, as it used to be called, for the digital age, for the networked age. Howard Rheingold is one of the pioneers in this. This particular collection I got from a couple of lecturers in the University of the Arts in London when I was working with them. Collaborate, create, communicate, critique, and curate. And of course, all of these interrelate. They're not independent competencies. And at the center is the people you're working with. This is a group of diplomats and foreign ministry officials in Pretoria. I happened to be there when Diplo was doing some training in public diplomacy, when they had a national day, a celebration for the diverse peoples within South Africa. And so these are diplomats presenting a more informal style. But what we're talking about here is the idea that if you are to be an effective operator in 2013 and indeed the rest of this decade and the rest of the century, you need to have a set of personal competencies that make you capable of operating effectively within social media. So to go through them a little bit more slowly, there are presentations on the Diplo slide share. I'll just pop that into the chat. So it's I'm an Italian keyboard and I can't find the appropriate. Sorry, slideshare.net. While I'm writing that, please admire Stefano Baldi, who is the director of the Istituto Diplomatico and who's been connected and had some joint working with Diplo for a number of years. Stefano, to me, is an absolutely classic example of somebody who's an effective curator. Stefano was an early user of a package called NetVibes. I don't know how many of you use NetVibes. You may use Google Reader. You might use packages called Feedly. But in a sense, what all of those packages do is they enable you to go out into the internet, which is full of too much information. Everybody complains about information overload. And what NetVibes and Google Reader and Feedly and others like that do, they enable you to go out once, select a series of things that you want to follow, a series of blogs, a series of news sites, a series of sites that regularly update, and bring them together into one window on a screen. And what NetVibes allows you to do is share that with your colleagues. And Stefano experimented in Brussels, gosh, a good 6 years ago, I think, bringing together information about science and about other issues that related to the Italian delegation in Brussels. And he has a blog, and within the blog for the Istituto, he brings together, in another form of curation, information from around the internet that is relevant to Italian diplomats, indeed anybody else who wants to work in conjunction with the Istituto. So the concept of curation is developing an understanding to be able to find the information you want. I mean, it's just to pause there for a moment. Google is everywhere. We all use Google, but as I'm sure many of you know, and if you haven't seen the TED talk on the filter bubble, I highly recommend it. There is no such thing anymore as a standard Google search. If I search for something and you search for something, we will not get the same results for the same word. It depends on where I'm located, so I get different results when I'm in Italy than when I'm in Oxford. Google customizes what it sends to me according to the information that it's gathered from watching me as I use Gmail and as I use Google Drive and as I use all the other Google products. And so if Deirdre Williams, who's one of the participants, does a search, whatever Deirdre's been doing on the internet will deliver to Deirdre an entirely different set of results. And so what that means that if you are to, one, promote the work that you want to do, you've got to find a way to make your work available through the customization of the search. You've also got to be able yourself to track through the kind of barriers that this filter bubble is putting up to us. So using specific searches like Google Scholar, being able to find specific resources related to diplomacy, for example. That's part of curation, particularly if you're in an embassy internationally, you're trying to gather information about the country in which you're working and present that information to your colleagues. Filtering, RSS feeds, this is really simple syndication. The NetVibes I was talking about, Google Reader, depend on feeds that come from sites. Being able to use those sites gives you enormous power in terms of curating. There's a whole range of important things around mind mapping, around personal bookmarking. We all go out online, we all find incredibly useful pieces of information. How do we share them with our colleagues? Traditionally, people use the favorites button on their browser, but of course, as soon as you leave your computer, you leave behind your favorites, and you can't share those collectively. There are a range of tools like Delicious, like Digo, which enable us to share those bookmarks There are online storage facilities where we can share and collaborate on different pieces of information. And then there's a public curation function. What Stefano is doing with the Istituto blog, for example, is in a public way bringing together resources to share for people interested in that particular area of work. Andreas Sandre, who works for the Italian embassy in Washington. Andreas NYC1, I can't remember his Twitter tag just for the moment. Excuse me, but Andreas is a very excellent example of a public curator. His Twitter account is buzzing, but if you want to find out what's current and popular, he's established himself a niche where he will give you information about what's happening in e-diplomacy and digital diplomacy, and in that sense he's become a public curator. Excuse me a moment, I've got an Italian cold. There are 2 points there from Luca. Governments indeed, Luca, retain a central role. I absolutely agree. But from Gaia, citizens engage much more, both individually and as groupings within civil society. But my general point is it's a different context. The fundamentals of mind mapping from Maria Ludovica. If you go and look at the site MindMeister, I'm typing it in. That's my favorite mind mapping tool. Essentially, mind mapping is, I'll have to use my hands, which is kind of difficult with a webcam because you're slightly weird. Essentially, what you do is you take a set of ideas. My diagram of create, collaborate is a mind map in a way. You establish particular sets of ideas on a screen or on a piece of paper. You draw links between them. I mean, that's so far so not very special. What MindMeister allows you to do is it allows you to build mind maps together. So when I do research projects with colleagues, or when I work with colleagues in Diplo and outside, we can establish a mind map, and we can each play with it in different parts of the world or in different offices. And so we are all, in a sense, playing with concepts and building up a picture, a shared, rich picture. Thank you very much, Eleanor. That's Andrea Sandra's Twitter account. So I'll move on because there's lots more to do. Curate. Collaborate. I'm sure many of you have come across the idea of DiploPedia. I mean, it's very much the poster child of the use of social tools. This is based on Wikipedia. It uses exactly the same software. It's built behind the firewall of the US State Department, and it's turned into a private, incredibly popular, 27,000 document popular resource for the State Department. These slides were very kindly provided by Richard Bowley when he was doing an e-diplomacy day organized in Geneva with Diplo and a number of other organizations in Geneva. And it's an example of what they put up quickly in 2010 around the Haiti earthquake. And what I think you can see there is that there are also static pages there that give you information that you need as diplomats in the State Department about procedures and all those kind of things. There are pages where people store information about good practice in different ways. This was an instant response to Haiti. And what the red bubble doesn't quite cover, if you can see on the page, is please feel free to add to the content. In other words, any person in the State Department, and they all have access to it, they could add suggestions, they could add pieces of news, they could add resources that could be used by those active in the response. So what you have is an instant collaborative tool for people within the State Department, globally, all focusing on one particular issue. Very powerful example of the use of social media for collaboration. Wikis, all the Google tools, blogs, online social networks, all can be used to collaborate. And I would strongly suggest that unless diplomats are comfortable with using those tools, very aware of their strengths and weaknesses, it's incredibly difficult to operate in the Lego world. Because if you're engaging with an NGO in an alliance and a coalition with a church organization and a couple of government ministries, how are you going to collaborate? You've all got separate firewalls. How do you find a space on the internet where you share documents, you share ideas, you have conversations? The fourth bullet, there are a range of examples. Again, if you look at the slide share from the 5Cs presentation, there's some interesting examples there of people putting up specific portals for crowdsourcing information. Ushahidi is an example. And another one I quote a lot is I Paid a Bribe, which is a site that started in India and was then copied in Kenya. I Paid a Bribe. I think it's .org. And it's a place where if you get stopped by a policeman and they want an instant fine, and you perfectly recognise it's not a fine, it's a small tip, then you can send a message from your mobile phone and say, this person, I've just had to pay a bribe in this context. And what you build up quite quickly is a picture of activity, because of course it's linked to maps, but you also begin to build a community. So being able to operate effectively using collaborative tools inside and outside a firewall is critical. 2 comments there. Yeah, DiploFoundation. I'm guessing, Gaia, I don't know which ministry you're in, Gaia, but it would be wonderful to have a democratic industry, and I'm glad to see the Brazilian MFA started DiploFoundation. Yeah, it does take time, Raphael, for people to engage. It will only take a couple of examples where it's very useful, as for example in the Haiti situation in the States, for people to suddenly recognize that's the space where you can get up-to-date, current, dynamic information. I apologize. I don't apologize really. I'm quite impressed with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Digital Diplomacy Directorate. The director of their program came and talked at a Diplo organised event 4 years ago, I think, in Malta, because the UK was one of the earliest spaces into it. And one of the things that's critical about this is this concept of assumed competence, and people who've heard us speak before may have come across this before. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, when it established its, sorry, I can't spell. When it established its digital diplomacy resources, started on the principle of assumed competence. I like to think, oops. I've got a note saying that, you can't see my notes. Apologies. I've been sending to all attendees, not all participants. So I'll re-put in my my notes. So I hope you can all see that. Assumed competence. Now I think this is quite unique in my experience. Not unique. It's unusual in my experience of working with foreign ministries. You start from the position that if you work for the UK Foreign Office, you're good. You spent some time getting selected. You've been well trained. I was just speaking to a colleague here in the Istituto. It's the same in Italy. It's not an easy task to get into a ministry. You've got to be good. You've got to do lots of training and learning, and then you are trained well. So the principle was, if you are already in the Commonwealth Office, well then fine, you can blog, you can tweet, you can add photographs in Flickr, you can be active in social media because you are already good enough to do it. If we can trust you to operate in a cocktail party or in a meeting with a ministry official, why can't we trust you in social media? And as a consequence, it's an incredibly active and vigorous site with a whole range, to me, of extremely interesting material. Ambassadors blog, not just ambassadors critically, staff up and down the hierarchy within embassies, within the ministry, are active in social media, which means you get a very rich picture of both for the domestic audience and for the international audience of what the UK is doing and what its position is in a variety of subjects. And of course, it's also active in other places, including Facebook. And it's a good example of, and perhaps it comes back to Raphael's point, if ministries can take it upon themselves to absolutely trust their own staff, that is what generates enthusiasm and activity within social media spaces. Of course, there are things to learn. Of course, it's useful to be supported by people who've had some training and so on. But by and large, I argue, this is actually an essential mainstream task for diplomats. You need to be able to operate in these spaces if you are to be effective. In that context, I'm talking about the key competency of creation. So you're at an event, you take a photograph. Where do you post it? Can you post it? Can you sort out the resolution? Can you blog? Are you comfortable blogging? Are you comfortable using video? Are you comfortable adding things into Wikipedia? In other words, are you able to comfortably create and share digital content? And are you aware of all the issues around copyright, privacy, and where your content could be seen? The final one is critique. This was a tweet that occurred while we were in South Africa doing the public diplomacy course for for the South African ministry, DIRCO. This is an MP a South African MP, who tweeted, "Why is #DIRCO," that's the Directorate of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, firewalling any information about its investigation to Ambassador Yusuf and the MTN group. And Clayton Monyela, you'll note that in the Twitter it's @Clayton Monyela, is the Director of Public Diplomacy in South Africa. Now that's really interesting. That's an MP in real time broadcasting publicly. MPs will tend to broadcast publicly to their constituents, to the ministry, saying, why aren't we hearing anything about this case? You'll note that immediately below, Clayton Monyela responded almost immediately. You actually haven't got the time there, but he did respond quickly, saying, yeah, we don't do investigations in public. And of course, Mania responded almost immediately saying, well, make the outcome, etc. And you can see what the exchange was. That's a remarkably different context to even 3-4 years ago, certainly since Twitter was available. The flexibility and speed of response required from public servants, from civil servants, from diplomats, is completely different to what it was before. Richard Worley, another colleague who works within Diplo, who's done a lot of work, he's a journalist, and he's done a lot of work in Brussels, talks about how Twitter has transformed the whole process of EU negotiations. So what used to be a process of kind of closed negotiation and closed conferences followed by press conferences is now a whole series of tweets. They're not necessarily leaks, but from almost the moment people arrive in particular meetings, somebody is tweeting, whether it's a minister, whether it's somebody in the room or somebody outside the room. And so the negotiations no longer, as they would have been traditionally in the billiard ball world, conducted behind closed doors between groups of specialists within with their own interest. It's actually a consistently public-private conversation. And this is an example of how you need to be able to critique and respond to critique. Ministries and diplomats need to monitor media. They need to be very good at establishing authenticity. There's a lot of fraud out there. And need to be comfortable and confident to reflect on your practice, to comment exactly as Clayton Monyela did there. He knew the context of Twitter, how you respond, and how to deal with that particular issue before it exploded. Apologies, there is one more. Communicate. And I'm going to use the example here from Mark McDowell, who's a Canadian diplomat. Some of you may know this already. In Beijing, like most of the ministries there, they are active in a site called Sinawebwa, which is one of the sites that I talked about before in China, which has got over 424,000 members. I mean, that's huge. And there are 3 other sites with as many members. And it's an important site. Yeah, it's become a kind of public discussion point. Mark gives this example of a train crash that took place in Wenzhou. And sometimes in those, well, often that kind of situation, there is no public statement. Nobody knows about it. But actually, it was somebody who was present at the scene, potentially a survivor, took a photograph and immediately posted it in Sinawebwa, and suddenly it went viral. Everybody knew about it. Therefore, the ministry had to respond. Classic Lego world. So it's become an essential part of public communication within China. This is Mark. He's been head of public diplomacy in the embassy. If you go onto the Diplo YouTube site, there are interviews of Mark there if you want to follow this up at all. And two things to say about that. And the first, this is kind of central to communicating. When they were setting up the Sinawebwa profile, they took a long time to establish what is the voice that we're trying to sell. Who are the audience? All channels of social media, identifying who's the audience you want to reach, what's the culture within that particular channel, So they thought to portray something which is informal, which is diverse, which is transparent, which is interesting. And Mark always tells the joke, this is almost diametrically opposed to the way that many diplomatic communications are carried out. And that's challenging. It's exactly Victoria's question at the beginning. It's extremely challenging for diplomats who've grown up within a context, particularly those, if you like, in the senior and middle ranks, who didn't grow up with this kind of media. They've grown up in a world which is quite formal, which is not necessarily diverse, which is certainly not transparent, and is quite often dull. And how do you then respond to these kind of media? Great case study, the ambassador's car. And this brings up another issue about how you manage risk within institutions when you're working in this. And I think that a couple of comments there about the difficulty of responding and the need to be flexible and handle risk. Without a great deal of forethought, in the Senior Webware site, the Canadian Embassy put a couple of pictures up of the ambassador's new car. I mean, it's not a particularly startling new car. And it attracted a couple of comments saying, well, it's not a particularly interesting car then, is it? But actually, there were many, many more comments about, well, that's interesting. Why does the ambassador for Canada, in a large and important country, have a small, fairly simple car when ministry officials have enormously expensive, often foreign cars? And what it turned into was a kind of viral, it very much became viral. It actually appeared in the mass media. People were commenting massively about the fact, the disjunction between this very modest car for the ambassador of a large and rich country and the cars available to ministries in regional offices, for example. And I haven't got the slides here, but actually by the end of the process, there was a response from the Chinese government talking about the need to review car policies. Now, that's interesting in itself. It's an example of the power of social media. It's an example of how you need to understand the channel and work within that channel, how within the ministry you need to develop skills to do that. Also, as a manager, how do you respond to this? You've got what you think is an innocuous, kind of interesting and quite fun and quite light public diplomacy campaign. Suddenly, you've got something which is potentially explosive. You could appear to be criticizing the government in which you are serving. In that particular case, after some conversations, the ambassador and Mark just sat it out. They sat and waited what happened, and it turned out correctly. It turned out well for them, if you like, and their response was correct. Let it go, see what the community does. And in that particular case, the community drove the conversation. They made very few comments back from the Canadian Embassy, and there was a resolution. So there's a huge amount of learning to be done, not just in terms of the skills, but in terms of how you operate as a culture within this space. And there have been a couple of comments there from Luca. You know, the top-down approach in the MFA, yeah, the change is happening around organizations, and organizations can close their eyes and wait for the change to break through the boundaries, or open their eyes and recognize the world is changing. And I say this as an outsider. So the skills around communication, being able to share and disseminate using all of those tools, wikis, discussion forums, emails, Google+, and so on, to promote the work that you do using different tools, and critically engage. The reason why the Senior Webware campaign worked was that they'd spent quite a lot of time in advance building up a network within Senior Webware. So people comment, they commented back. People said they liked that, they liked them back. People asked questions, they gave them answers. They put polls, they put quizzes. So they built up a network, which was the network that did the conversation. So social media is all about going out and talking, and that's not necessarily the way that diplomats have traditionally operated. We use this driving license in other contexts. This, for me, is the kind of minimum set of skills that a new diplomat, certainly an effective digital diplomat, needs to operate. Down the left-hand side is the competencies. Down the right-hand side are examples of using these various items of material. It's an interesting list. If you can feel confident to operate all of those, you can count yourself a digital diplomat. Actually, it's less daunting than it looks. Once you've learned to do one thing, if you've learned to blog, you can edit a Google document. If you can do a wiki, you can use, you know what I mean? There are some standard skills, but as is the conversation showing, it is about culture. And yes, I'm sure there are gender issues in there, absolutely. So we'll pause here for questions. I've been going for 40 minutes, which is a long time. Questions to you. Who do you think needs to be trained? Is it all staff? Should all ministries run a comprehensive training program across the ministry? Should it just be the communicators who then support other people, which means actually employing communicators? What about a minimal threshold? I was talking to Ms. Baldini, a new entrant. Should this be a minimum entrant for all people who come into ministries? And what have I missed out? What other competencies should we include? Luca thinks it will be all staff. Permanent training at all levels. Yeah, I agree, Luca. I'm just looking back through the chat. So any comments, any questions? So this is a point for questions. I'm going back to Victoria's question from the very beginning. Victoria said, social media has great potential in the governance, but the skills among the diplomats, confidentiality and confidence could be threatening factors that might hinder its optimal usage. I think you're absolutely right. And my suggestion as a response to that is very much about training. The only way that you can feel confident in using Twitter, being able to understand, Clayton Moniela, the head of public diplomacy in South Africa, is a classic case. He's learned how to use it. He feels entirely confident in responding instantly to an MP asking a potentially difficult question to the ministry. He knows the medium. He understands what you can do in 140 characters. A point there from Dahlia, yeah, training of managers is actually, I think, critical. In other organizations that I've worked in, and Diplo has done the same, there's something about focusing on the senior management level. They need a different set of training, because I don't think you necessarily, I would necessarily not expect all ambassadors, all senior managers to be completely comfortable with all of these tools, because actually senior managers don't have time for that. They do a whole range of other things. But it's important to say that there are lots of examples of senior people who are active. I was for Diplo in Mexico City earlier this year, working with the MFA there. And it's remarkable that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has, I think, nearly 500,000 followers. And the Ministry of Tourism, I was talking to the two of them, also has the same number of followers. They both find time. They're ministers, and they find time to be active on Twitter. In fact, the Minister of Foreign Affairs uses it as a listening tool. He doesn't actually, he's not very active himself, but he uses it to follow what's going on. Whereas the Minister of Tourism is a woman who finds it a superb medium for directly communicating with people around issues that matter for her work. So there are indeed people at that level who find the tools incredibly important, incredibly useful. But the reality for a lot of senior managers is there is an atmosphere around social media. It's something that the children do. It's something that younger people do. It's all a bit risky because we keep hearing about identity theft and so on. So I think the kind of training that is particularly relevant for senior managers needs to be around an understanding of risk very much. What are the real risks and how do you manage risk? What are the real resource implications and how do you manage the resource implications? A couple of points. Looking through the comments there. Strong investment, training at all levels. Yeah, it's about leadership. I agree, Dahlia. It's about training at all levels. You need support from leaders. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, it's about confidence and responsibility to be creative. That's a lovely quote from Gaia Deniz. It's responsibility to be creative. Diplomats have always been creative, but being creative face to face and in managing negotiations. it's taking that creativity into a different space and understanding, clearly there are constraints and risks within that space, but that's the space to be. From Liz Galvez. Yeah, unlearning some of the perhaps inappropriate habits of private social networking. I don't know many organizations who haven't at least once made the mistake of putting up the staff party on some social network, on Facebook or on Flickr. There's a picture of somebody with a bottle or a glass. It shouldn't happen. Training of trainers from Cleopa. Crisis management, absolutely. I've got an example in a moment of crisis management. And absolutely, Deirdre, things are different in different cultures. Well, I think that's interesting. Deirdre asked a question about language differences. I mean, I think that's the example of the UK FCO in, using Arabic, and the Canadian ministry, and indeed all the other ministries, sorry, all the other embassies in Beijing using Chinese languages. Yes, I don't think it's any different to taking a posting in any country in the way the diplomats have done for hundreds of years. In order to be effective within that country, you need to learn the language, you need to understand the culture, you need to understand how to operate within that culture. Those cultures are simply reflected in social media. I think one of the major misconceptions is that social media is somehow a different world. It's not a different world. We can experiment with identity. I'm a bit too old to experiment with identity, but people do experiment with identity in social media, to be clear, particularly younger people sometimes. But by and large, social media is simply a reflection of the world that we live in. There's no difference to it. And so how we operate within our national contexts in social media is no different to how we operate in our national contexts on the ground, face to face. So yes, it's taking the same skills, the same learning, the same training out into the virtual online world, the network world. Nico, I've not got your question. From Gaia. Nico, Nico, could you repeat your question, please? I've got a few more slides. We've got 10 more minutes, so I'll just take you down them quickly, because I think they're a kind of an introduction to some of the work I think we want to explore in Diplo over the next year. Nico, I can see you. Do you read me now? Nico, you're sending it to all panelists, which means I can see it. I also made the mistake earlier. By the way, the SlideShare account that I was talking about is, no, it's not .net, it's .com. That's where we put up a lot of the slides. Yeah, so Nico Frandi's been sending some questions that we haven't been seeing because they've been coming to all panelists. So Nico, add your questions in. I've got about 10 more minutes, and I just want to show you a couple of things. Unless people have got any more questions, I'll wait for a few seconds more for any more questions. This webinar will be available as a recording. You were asking about the risk, so Nico was asking about the risks of exposing private issues. Yes, information that can be manipulated against us. I think the my response to the issue of privacy and control of what is available, for me, that's partly the competency of curation. If you don't go into Facebook and manage your own page and your own formality, you have no, I'm sorry, you have no reason for sympathy if somebody takes information about you. You can manage a Facebook profile. Clearly, Facebook could be hacked. Twitter was hacked last week. But in general terms, you can control quite a lot of what, that's the skill of curation. You can control what's available about you. In terms of privacy, WikiLeaks wasn't an electronic leak. WikiLeaks was an individual who took some information out through the door and made it available outside. The majority of password incursions happen because people write their passwords under their keyboards or on the edge of their display monitors, or use their birthdays or their wife's maiden names. With a minimum level of security, you can control information. The second point is that, for me, social media, particularly the more informal media, Twitter and Facebook, are very like cocktail parties. Diplomats have used cocktail parties for generations. You go to diplomatic parties, you go to diplomatic receptions and events. Diplomats learn to manage what they say, and in many situations that is precisely the point at which something leaks, which is a little bit more confidential, deliberately. So diplomats have learned to negotiate those informal situations effectively. Learning to operate within social media is a very similar set of skills. It's simply learning the new language, the new context, the new environment. A couple more questions from Alina. Sorry, the long question from Mahfouja. Okay. Yeah, Mahfouja's point, I mean, it's about starting with a positive framework, and I think I would agree with that. From Luke. Yeah, and I think that there is, again, it's learning to negotiate when you're private, when you're public, and what you put up and what you don't put up. Dalina asked the question. What was the Dalina's question? Sorry. Okay, how do you say that somebody is really engaging? There is a whole industry around measurement. One, I'll come back to Francesca's point in a moment. I communicate, so I exist. The point about measurement, there are a whole range of tools. Number one, social media analytics is a whole industry. There are a range of tools, from Google Analytics to specific Twitter tools to Facebook themselves provide analytics. So you can provide information about who is reading your tweet, what happens to your link, did somebody download the document, did somebody pass it on. So there are standard electronic measurements. For me, that only measures probably the tip of the iceberg. The point of the story about Sina Webwo is that the engagement is about the comments between people. And if you're to demonstrate to management the impact of social media, the way to do it is to keep gathering the comments that you get. And a long time ago, when I first started, 2007, which is when these things first appeared, it's hardly any time at all ago. In order to persuade management, at that stage in my life, it was a large international NGO based in the UK, we kept track of all the comments. And what we found in social media is that people are much more personal. So they would make comments to this organization that are more personal than you would get from an email or from a phone call. And so part about measuring the impact is who's the social media metrics, what's actually happening to the stuff you do. How much engagement do you get? Do people retweet if you're on Twitter? Do people comment if you write blog posts? Do people engage with you on Facebook? And then gathering the information that people actually provide you in their comments. In terms of the overall impact, you're talking about something which is unmeasurable, because actually the way that social media works is through webs of influence. So I influence the people who connect to me, who in turn influence other people. It's very hard to track that. But we know, just to take an obvious example, from the impact of viral campaigns, the extraordinary explosion online following the grotesque rapes in India recently. I mean, social media played a role in amplifying the outrage that people felt, and played a role in organizing people, bringing them together on demonstrations and so on. So there are tools you can use to help you, which are kind of proxy indicators of impact. The reality is you can really only tell to some kind of physical manifestation, as in the demonstrations, as in petitions, as in downloading of documents or books, for example. So that I hope, Berenice, that gives you an answer. It's not just about the number of followers, it's about the level of engagement. Who's actually engaging with you, and then what are they saying? There was a comment there about I communicate therefore I am. Communication is essential. I like that. I mean, my answer to you, Francesca, is that I think diplomats have always been superb communicators above all. You can't be an effective diplomat if you aren't an effective communicator, surely. Aren't diplomats communicators? That's how you operate. And I think the 21st century is about communicating everywhere that people communicate, which now includes the online world. It includes social media, which I think is what some people have been saying. Absolutely, Raphael. Indeed, Eleanor. What diplomacy without... and Nico, yes. You need common sense, but of course you need to be critical. You can be the target, but I would argue you are no more... well, you are a little bit more exposed using social media, but there's no surprise that DiploPedia is behind the firewall of the US State Department. So they're using the wiki to communicate and collaborate, but they're doing it behind the firewall, and that's controlling the communicating outside world. I repeat, WikiLeaks was not about breaking the firewall. WikiLeaks was about an individual taking a CD out of the building and not being discovered. So I don't think security has changed. Yes, you have to learn the new context, but I don't think online tools by themselves make the world a less secure place, because there are people that operate to manage that security. Nico, I'll go back to, you can control what information is provided into social networks. The question from Andrea, I would again use the metaphor of the cocktail party. I know that things are said informally in cocktail parties that aren't said formally, and I think social media operates in much the same way. You can hint about things, you can make statements there, but yes, you have to extend what you normally do into social media. That's the principle of assumed competence. As diplomats, you understand what should be public, what shouldn't be public, what is safe to say, what is not to say, what is not safe to say. That extends into social media. Just coming down. From Francesca, we spend a lot of time on social media. Yeah, but if that's where your friends are, if that's where your audience is, and you're engaged in public diplomacy, or if you are trying to communicate with the public from an embassy, well, I don't spend a lot of time personally. Well, I do. I spend some time on personal social media, but then I turn it off. We can control which parties we go to, which groups we belong to. Oh dear, there's somebody putting in some Latin. Although I had an expensive private education in Scotland, I never learned Latin. Verba volant scripta manent. Ah, yes. Yeah. Isn't that the skill of diplomats, Liz? Being able to draw fine lines between public and private. Words spoken fly, written stay. Well, these days, words spoken fly. Possibly. That's true. I can't say that's not true, Raphael. It does apply to the internet. It's absolutely true. That's part of learning the culture. We've actually come to the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the last slide, which came out of the Diplomacy Day in Geneva. So we didn't get as far as organizational capability. Maybe that's the subject for another webinar another time. During the e-Diplomacy Day in Geneva, Jovan Kambalia asked the panel presenters and others to suggest some key principles. I think it's kind of an interesting place to close, because these were the people that were speaking. Richard Bowley was one, from the US State Department. They were experienced managers. They'd been using, they were pioneers, they are pioneers in the use of these tools. This may strike a chord with some of you. Principle 1, put users in the driving seat, particularly people who have more confidence in these tools. If you're developing a policy, keep it simple. Don't waste a lot of money on it. You don't need to spend a lot of money on it, and if you spend a lot of money, you'll attract lots of attention and slow things down, which is the same as the fourth point. If you have a strategy, everybody needs to be involved. Fifth, and this is the key point about Sina Webber and Mark McDowell's learning from Beijing, you can't succeed without failure. You need to take risk. There will be failures. Keep the experiments small so you can learn the lessons. Use the people, point 6. Point 7, it's not just public diplomacy. DiploPedia demonstrates above all else that it's about using tools flexibly. Exactly your point, Raphael. You can't control the message. So craft what it is you want to say, track what is said, monitor what is said, be able to respond. Clayton Moniella is a good example of that. Finally, which several people have said, unless you can convince the managers, the senior managers within the ministry, it will be very hard to get innovation. So, final point from Pietro, too much information. Well, my answer to that would be curate the information. Choose the information you want to get from the flood and share that information. That's one of the key tools to avoid being swamped by the floods. And yes, we need strategy, but a tiny strategy. You need direction, Liz, I think. I'm a strong believer in what's called emergent strategy. The slides that I was going to show you are based on the concept of capability. And it's a term used regularly within the military because the principle within military planning is that the moment the battle starts, all your plans go out the window. It won't actually work the way you think it's going to work. So what you do is you develop the capability to respond to a variety of contexts. And the example that we discovered, for example, when we were training in Bahrain, the sudden explosion in social media around the disturbances last year, and the ministry weren't able to respond. So it's about developing capability to be able to respond to crises, which I don't think is a strategy. I think it's about understanding that there needs to be capacity within a ministry, individual competencies, and in that context, being able to respond. Maybe that's a minimum strategy. From Dahlia, is e-diplomacy really more than public diplomacy? Yes, it is my answer. But yes, for more discussion. Certainly public diplomacy, e-diplomacy is a central part of public diplomacy. I would argue that DiploPedia, for example, is a classic example of using e-tools to support diplomatic functions. And there are other examples like that. Well, I'm terribly sorry, but I do have to go. I have to go out now and get a flight back to the UK. So thank you very much. It's been a very stimulating conversation for me. We'll be posting train and ensure bottom-up competencies. Absolutely agree with Fernando de la Mora. I have to go. Thank you very much for all the conversations. I learned a lot from it. Good questions. The slide we put up on SlideShare probably early next week, and we'll communicate that with you. Thanks very much, everybody. I need to go now. Bye.